National Electrical Code Section 110.26 addresses spaces about electrical equipment. This section is critical for ensuring the safety of personnel who may be working on or near electrical equipment while it is energized. The specific requirement you are concerned with falls under Condition 2 of 110.26, which pertains to situations where there are exposed live parts on both sides of the workspace, or where exposed live parts are on one side and grounded parts on the other. The purpose of the working space is to provide enough room for electricians and other qualified personnel to safely approach, access, and work on electrical equipment. This includes tasks like operating switches, performing maintenance, troubleshooting, and making repairs. Adequate working space reduces the risk of electrical shock, arc flash, and other hazards. The minimum depth of the working space, measured from the front of the electrical equipment, depends on the nominal voltage to ground and the conditions of the installation. Condition 1 applies where there are exposed live parts on one side of the workspace and no grounded parts or grounded conductive parts on the other side of the workspace, or where grounded parts are suitably guarded or insulated. Condition 2 applies where there are exposed live parts on one side of the workspace and grounded parts on the other side. Concrete, brick, and tile walls are considered grounded. Condition 3 applies where there are exposed live parts on both sides of the workspace. The working space must be clear and unobstructed. This means that there should be no pipes, ducts, or other equipment within the required working space. Doors and panels must be able to open at least 90 degrees. The minimum width of the working space is 30 inches or the width of the equipment, whichever is greater. The minimum height of the working space is 6 feet 6 inches or the height of the equipment, whichever is greater. For 480-volt systems, which is your case, Condition 2 mandates a minimum working space of 3½ feet. It is important to accurately determine the voltage to ground in your system to correctly apply the requirements of 110.26. In a 480-volt three-phase system, the voltage to ground depends on the type of system grounding. If it's a solidly grounded Y system, the voltage to ground is 277 volts. If it's a corner grounded delta system, the voltage to ground is 480 volts. However, for the purposes of 110.26, the nominal voltage between conductors is used to determine the working space. Therefore, for a 480-volt system, you must adhere to the requirements specified for the voltage range regardless of the specific grounding configuration. If your installation does not meet the minimum working space requirements, you have several options to consider. Firstly, relocate the ATS switches. Moving the switches to a location where you can achieve the required 3½ feet of clearance is the most straightforward solution. This might involve reconfiguring the layout of the electrical room or finding a different location altogether. Secondly, explore using smaller ATS switches. If physically possible, consider using ATS switches that are more compact in size. This could potentially reduce the overall footprint of the installation and allow you to meet the working space requirements. Thirdly, implement physical barriers. If relocating the switches is not feasible, you might be able to use physical barriers to effectively create Condition 1. For example, you could install an insulated barrier between the live parts and any grounded surfaces. This would allow you to use the smaller working space requirements of Condition 1. Fourthly, seek a variance or exception. In some cases, it might be possible to obtain a variance or exception from the local electrical inspector. This would require demonstrating that the installation provides an equivalent level of safety, even though it does not strictly comply with the code requirements. Be prepared to provide detailed documentation and justification for your request. When working with electrical equipment, always prioritize safety. Energize equipment before working on it whenever possible. Use appropriate personal protective equipment, such as safety glasses, gloves, and insulated tools. Follow all applicable safety procedures and regulations. Always consult with a qualified electrician or electrical engineer to ensure that your installation complies with all applicable codes and regulations. Understanding and adhering to the working space requirements of National Electrical Code Section 110. 26 is essential for ensuring the safety of personnel working on or near electrical equipment. By carefully considering the voltage conditions and available options, you can create a safe and compliant installation. The most important part is to consider the available options for compliance. Always consider safety first when it comes to energized electrical components. When planning an electrical installation, always consider the working space requirements of National Electrical Code Section 110.26. This will help you to avoid potential problems and ensure that the installation is safe and compliant. The working space must be clear and unobstructed. This means that there should be no pipes, ducts, or other equipment within the required working space. Doors and panels must be able to open at least 90 degrees. The minimum width of the working space is 30 inches or the width of the equipment, whichever is greater. The minimum height of the working space is 6 feet 6 inches or the height of the equipment, whichever is greater. If the working space is not clear and unobstructed, it can be difficult or impossible to safely work on the electrical equipment. This can increase the risk of electrical shock, arc flash, and other hazards. The National Electrical Code is updated every 3 years. It is important to stay up to date on the latest changes to the code to ensure that your electrical installations are safe and compliant. The National Electrical Code is a complex document. If you have any questions about the code, you should consult with a qualified electrician or electrical engineer. Remember, the safety of yourself and others depends on following the National Electrical Code. Always take the time to understand the code requirements and follow them carefully. In summary, firstly, always ensure adequate working space around electrical equipment. Secondly, understand the different conditions outlined in NEC 110.26. Thirdly, prioritize safety by de-energizing equipment when possible and using appropriate PPE. And fourthly, consult with qualified professionals to ensure code compliance.